Jeffrey Sachs isn't known for holding back, but this time he took it to another level. In a room filled with diplomats, politicians, and global analysts, he shredded European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Western leadership in a way that left even seasoned commentators speechless. His words, a disgrace to Europe. Not just rhetoric, he backed it up with numbers, facts, and a brutal assessment of Europe's economic and geopolitical failures. The room didn't just fall silent. Some people couldn't even make eye contact. So what did Sachs say that sent shockwaves through European leadership? And more importantly, was he right? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll see why Sachs believes Europe's policies are unraveling, and why their worst mistake might have been listening to Washington. Jeffrey Sachs didn't just criticize European leadership, he dismantled it with hard numbers. In a recent speech, he slammed von der Leyen's handling of the Russia-Ukraine war, arguing that her policies have left Europe economically crippled, while failing to weaken Russia. Eurostat data confirms that Germany, the largest economy in Europe, suffered a 0.3% contraction in 2023, while Russia's GDP expanded by 3.6%, fueled by surging energy exports to China and India. Sachs pointed out that while European industries struggle under high energy costs, Moscow has redirected its oil and gas trade to Asia, maintaining revenue streams even as European households and manufacturers face soaring inflation. Europe is not punishing Russia, it is punishing itself, Sachs stated, citing Germany's BASF, which is slashing jobs at home while investing $10 billion in China due to unaffordable energy costs. Before sanctions, Europe imported 155 billion cubic meters of Russian gas annually, covering 40% of its total supply. Within months of cutting ties, wholesale gas prices in Europe spiked over 300%, forcing energy-intensive industries, chemicals, steel, and automotive, to scale back or shut down. According to Bloomberg, BASF cut 2,600 jobs in Germany due to energy costs, while ArcelorMittal closed blast furnaces in Spain and France. France's INSEE data shows that industrial production fell by 5.2% in 2023, with Germany's factory orders plunging by 11.3% year over year, according to the Federal Statistical Office. Geopolitically, European unity has fractured, with Hungary's Viktor Orbán openly challenging EU sanctions, warning they are weakening Europe's global standing while failing to isolate Russia. Meanwhile, Russia's trade with BRICS nations hit a record $230 billion in 2023, strengthening its geopolitical position despite the West's attempts to isolate it. Sachs pointed out that Russia wasn't just an energy supplier, it was a critical export market. In 2021, Germany sold $27 billion worth of goods to Russia, while France and Italy each exported over $10 billion. With these trade links severed, European businesses have lost key revenue streams, while Russia has pivoted to China and India. The Financial Times reports that Chinese trade with Russia jumped 64% year over year, with Chinese car manufacturers now dominating the Russian auto market, replacing brands like Volkswagen and Renault. Meanwhile, the EU's GDP growth stalled at just 0.5% in 2023, according to the European Commission, compared to Russia's 3.6% growth, fueled by strong trade ties with Asia. Sachs argued that von der Leyen's strategy was economically suicidal, pointing out that Russia's energy profits surged by 28% in 2023, while European consumers faced record-high electricity bills, with Germany's power costs exceeding €400 per megawatt hour, nearly quadruple pre-war levels. While Europe sacrificed its economic ties with Russia, the United States capitalized on the crisis. Washington increased LNG exports to Europe by 141% in 2023, according to Reuters, with American suppliers charging 4 times the price of Russian pipeline gas. Meanwhile, the United States passed the Inflation Reduction Act, injecting $369 billion in subsidies for American industries, making North America a more attractive hub for European companies. German automaker Volkswagen is now prioritizing U.S. expansion to access IRA subsidies, while French energy giant Total Energies is investing in American LNG projects instead of European ones. According to Sachs, this wasn't an accident. The United States dictated Europe's strategy, but it didn't take the same risks. Washington got cheaper Russian oil through back channels, while Europe was left paying premium rates for American gas. He cited a Bloomberg investigation revealing that Russian crude is still flowing into U.S. markets via Indian refineries, despite Western sanctions. Sachs pointed to a 1990 U.S. promise to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. Despite this, NATO has grown from 16 to 32 members, adding former Soviet states like Poland, the Baltics, and most recently, Finland and Sweden. Russia repeatedly warned that NATO's push into Ukraine, a country historically aligned with Moscow, would be a red line. According to declassified U.S. cables from the National Security Archive, senior American diplomats, including former Defense Secretary William Perry, cautioned that NATO's expansion could trigger a military response. This was predictable, Sachs argued. If China built military bases in Mexico, the United States wouldn't tolerate it for a second. But Europe ignored the same logic when it came to Russia. He cited former German Chancellor Angela Merkel's 2022 admission that the 2014 Minsk agreements, meant to prevent war, were never actually implemented as NATO planned for Ukraine's military buildup. Sachs revealed that a peace deal was on the table in April 2022, brokered by Turkey, which could have ended the war early. According to the Financial Times, the deal involved Ukraine agreeing to neutrality in exchange for security guarantees, avoiding NATO membership while maintaining sovereignty. However, US and UK officials reportedly pressured Ukraine to abandon negotiations, believing prolonged conflict would weaken Russia. French President Emmanuel Macron also attempted to push for European-led security talks, but his efforts were sidelined as Washington took control of the diplomatic process. Instead of diplomacy, Europe doubled down on sanctions, an approach Sachs argues has backfired spectacularly, leaving the continent weakened while Russia emerges economically stronger. Jeffrey Sachs argues that U.S. policymakers and Western think tanks intentionally backed Russia into a geopolitical dead end, leaving Moscow with limited options short of military action. He points to declassified U.S. cables from the National Security Archive, revealing that American officials were repeatedly warned by foreign policy experts, including former U.S. ambassadors to Russia, that NATO's expansion risked triggering conflict. A 2015 Rand Corporation report, funded by the Pentagon, explicitly outlined strategies to overextend and unbalance Russia, recommending economic sanctions, energy supply disruptions, and military pressure through NATO's eastern flank. Sachs also cites George Kennan, the architect of U.S. Cold War containment policy, who called NATO's expansion into former Soviet states the most fateful error of American policy that would inflame Russian nationalism and militarism. The results, Sachs argues, were predictable. Russia's security concerns were ignored, and Europe was forced into an economic war that has hurt its own economy more than Moscow's. Sanctions were supposed to cripple Russia's economy, but the latest data from Russia's Federal Statistics Service shows GDP expanded by 3.6% in 2023, exceeding initial forecasts. Meanwhile, Germany, Europe's largest economy, contracted by 0.3%, and the Eurozone posted an anemic 0.5% GDP growth, according to the European Central Bank. While Russia rerouted 70% of its energy exports to China and India, per Bloomberg Europe, scrambled to secure expensive U.S. liquefied natural gas, paying 4 times more than pre-war pipeline prices. The energy crisis forced major European manufacturers like BASF and ArcelorMittal to shut down production lines, cutting thousands of jobs. A report from the German Chamber of Commerce estimates that over 40% of small and medium-sized manufacturers are considering offshoring to China or North America due to unsustainable energy costs. Sachs asserts that these sanctions have not only failed, but have undermined Europe's industrial competitiveness while strengthening Russia's economic alliances with BRICS nations. Sachs emphasizes that Europe's economic downturn is not an accident. It's a direct result of policies that have made European industry less competitive. Germany's industrial output fell by 8.6% year-over-year in Q4 2023, per Germany's Federal Statistical Office, with manufacturing orders down by 11.3% due to energy costs. France's energy-intensive industries saw a 30% production decline, according to INSEE, while the UK narrowly avoided a recession with 0.1% GDP growth in Q4, per the Bank of England. Meanwhile, Russia's energy profits surged 28% in 2023, with Chinese and Indian demand for Russian crude oil soaring to record highs, according to Reuters. European businesses are not just struggling, they're relocating. Volkswagen has announced a $5 billion investment in the U.S. to take advantage of Inflation Reduction Act subsidies, while BASF is expanding in China. Sachs describes Europe's economic trajectory as a self-inflicted wound driven by ideological foreign policy rather than economic pragmatism. NATO's open-door policy, allowing any nation to apply for membership, has long been a point of contention. Since the end of the Cold War, NATO has added 14 Eastern European countries, extending military infrastructure to Russia's doorstep. Sachs compares this to China, stationing military bases in Canada or Mexico, arguing that Washington would view such a move as an existential security threat. Declassified NATO meeting minutes from 1990 confirm that US and European leaders verbally assured Soviet leaders that NATO would not expand beyond Germany's reunification. Yet by 2023, NATO had incorporated Finland and Sweden, fueling Moscow's perception of encirclement. A 2021 Foreign Affairs report highlighted that Ukraine's NATO ambitions were seen as a red line in Moscow's strategic calculus. Sachs argues that Europe, instead of pursuing a neutral security arrangement, followed a confrontational path that escalated tensions and now bears the economic fallout. Sachs warns that Europe is at an inflection point. Either continue aligning with Washington at the cost of its economic future, or pivot toward restoring pragmatic trade relations. The EU's 2024 winter economic forecast projects near zero growth for the next 2 years, raising concerns of prolonged stagnation. Meanwhile, Russia's trade with China and India hit a record $230 billion in 2023, according to Russia's Ministry of Economic Development. While Germany remains hesitant, France's Emmanuel Macron has started calling for a European security dialogue independent of NATO, suggesting some European leaders are reconsidering Washington's strategy. Sachs believes that Europe must push for a negotiated end to the Ukraine conflict and reintegrate Russian energy supplies to stabilize its industrial base. However, he warns that if Europe waits too long, China will fully replace the EU as Russia's primary economic partner, making a return to pre-2022 trade ties unlikely. Sachs argues that every year of continued sanctions and hostility further cements Russia's pivot toward Asia. In 2021, the EU accounted for 38% of Russia's trade. By 2023, that number had dropped to just 15%, while China alone now represents over 30% of Russian trade volume, according to the Russian Customs Service. European policymakers face a narrowing window. If they do not re-establish energy and industrial ties soon, they risk permanently losing market share to Chinese, Indian, and Middle Eastern competitors. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz recently signaled interest in reopening diplomatic channels, but Moscow has yet to indicate any willingness to return to pre-war relations, viewing Europe as an unreliable partner. Sachs warns that if the EU fails to act decisively, It risks long-term economic decline while Washington benefits from energy sales and industrial realignment. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.